On a warm spring night in 1980, two coworkers stood waiting in a hospital parking lot in Orange, California, expecting a woman named Dorothy Jane Scott to pull the car around so she could drive them home. They watched her headlights swing toward them across the dark lot. Then, without slowing, the car turned sharply and sped away into the night, its high beams so bright that neither man could see who was behind the wheel or whether Dorothy was even still inside it. They waited. She did not come back. Within the hour, they called the police to report her missing, but by then Dorothy Jane Scott had already vanished from the world she knew, and the car that disappeared into the darkness that night would not be seen again until the next morning, when it turned up 10 miles away, burned down to the frame, abandoned and empty. Before we go further into this story, please consider subscribing to Cold Case Whisperer. It's much appreciated, and it helps us keep bringing you real cold case stories like this one. Dorothy Jane Scott was born on April 23, 1948, and by the spring of 1980, she was 32 years old, a single mother raising a 4-year-old son. She lived in the small city of Stanton, California, with her aunt, in a modest household about 20 minutes from Anaheim, where her parents, Jacob and Vera Scott, lived nearby and where Dorothy herself worked. Her job was as a secretary for 2 adjoining businesses in Anaheim, a psychedelic shop called Swingers and a head shop called Custom John's, both jointly owned by a man named John Cossola. The businesses had once belonged to Dorothy's own father, and Jacob Scott still worked there as a handyman, well known and well liked by everyone on staff. Those who knew Dorothy in those years described her in strikingly consistent terms. She was quiet. She was devoutly religious. She did not drink, and she did not use drugs, even though she worked in a shop that sold the paraphernalia associated with both. She rarely dated, and by her father's own account, the family did not know of any steady boyfriend in her life at the time she disappeared. She preferred to be home with her young son, and her parents often helped care for him while she worked her long days at the shop. The boy's father, a man named Dennis Terry, was not a consistent presence in the household, and in the earliest days of the investigation into Dorothy's disappearance, he was one of the first people detectives looked at, a routine step in any case involving a missing mother. He was quickly ruled out. Investigators confirmed that at the time Dorothy vanished, Dennis Terry was in Missouri, hundreds of miles from Orange County, and could not have been involved in whatever happened to her that night. In the spring of 1980, Orange County, California, was a region in the middle of enormous growth, its orange groves steadily giving way to suburban tract housing, shopping plazas, and the kind of sprawling freeway network that was reshaping Southern California at the time. Anaheim itself was best known nationally as the home of Disneyland, a place associated in the public imagination with family vacations and manufactured cheerfulness, which made the quiet, unresolved horror of what happened to one of its residents that spring feel even more jarring to the community when the story eventually became public. Dorothy's daily life, by every account left behind, was small and steady. She went to work. She came home to her son. She spent time with her parents nearby. She did not seek out attention, and in the ordinary run of things, there was little about her routine that would have suggested she was in any particular danger, apart from the one dark thread running underneath it: the telephone calls that had begun months earlier and that no one around her could explain. In the earliest hours of May 29th, 1980, Dorothy Jane Scott's family began a wait that would ultimately stretch across more than 4 decades. What made Dorothy's disappearance different from an ordinary missing persons case, from the very first days investigators worked it, was the fact that she had not been living an anonymous life in the months before she vanished. Beginning sometime in early 1980, Dorothy began receiving strange telephone calls at work. The caller was a man, his voice unfamiliar, and his message shifted without warning between two extremes. In one breath, he would tell her that he loved her. In the next, he would threaten her life. Coworkers remembered the calls disturbing her visibly, though Dorothy, by nature private and unwilling to worry the people around her, did not always share the full details of what she was hearing. On at least one occasion, the caller instructed her to go outside to her car, and when she did, she found a dead rose lying on the windshield, left there deliberately, a small and chilling message that someone had been close enough to her vehicle to place it there unnoticed. On another occasion, according to accounts of the calls that later reached investigators and reporters, the man told her plainly that when he got her alone, he would cut her into pieces so that no one would ever find her. The threat frightened Dorothy enough that she began to think seriously about her own safety. She considered buying a gun. In the end, she chose a different path, enrolling instead in karate classes, hoping that she could learn to protect herself if it ever came to that. No one around her, not her family, not her co-workers, not the police she may or may not have spoken to before it was too late, ever identified who the caller was. He remained, in the months leading up to her disappearance, nothing more than a voice on a telephone line, untraceable and unidentified, and he would remain exactly that for the rest of the case's history. It is worth pausing here on how limited the tools available to Dorothy and to the people around her actually were in 1980. There was no caller identification available on home or business telephones at the time. There was no way for a private citizen receiving threatening calls to simply glance at a screen and see a number. A person in Dorothy's position, hearing a stranger's voice alternate between professions of love and threats of violence, had almost no way to identify who was speaking to her unless that person chose, deliberately, to reveal himself. That basic technological limitation, one that would seem almost unthinkable to callers and victims alike only a few decades later, shaped nearly every part of how this case unfolded, from the calls Dorothy received at work to the calls her mother would go on receiving for years afterward. There's another limitation worth naming plainly, because it shaped how seriously a case like Dorothy's could even be treated before she disappeared. In 1980, the word stalking did not yet exist as a legal term in California or anywhere else in the United States. There was no specific crime that fit what Dorothy was experiencing, a stranger repeatedly contacting her, alternating between declarations of love and explicit threats to her life. California would not become the first state in the country to pass a dedicated anti-stalking law until 1990, a full decade after Dorothy vanished, a change in the law prompted in part by a string of cases across the state in which women who had reported being harassed and threatened were later killed by the same men who had been harassing them. Whether or not a dedicated stalking law would have changed the outcome for Dorothy Jane Scott is impossible to say. What can be said is that in the spring of 1980, a woman who was afraid enough of an anonymous caller to consider buying a gun, and who instead enrolled in self-defense classes, had very few formal options available to her beyond hoping the threats never became real. The night everything changed was May 28th, 1980. Dorothy had attended an employee meeting earlier that day at the shop where she worked, an ordinary part of her routine. During the meeting, she noticed that a co-worker named Conrad Bostron did not look well, and that he had an unusual red mark on his arm. Concerned, Dorothy offered to help, and together with another co-worker, she drove Bostron to the UCI Medical Center in the city of Orange, worried that whatever had bitten or stung him might be serious. Doctors at the hospital determined that Bostron had been bitten by a black widow spider. He was treated, monitored, and by around 11 o'clock that night he had recovered enough to be released. Dorothy, who had parked some distance from the entrance, told her co-workers she would go retrieve the car and bring it around so they would not have to walk far in the dark. She walked out into the parking lot alone. What happened in the minutes that followed has never been fully explained. Her co-workers, waiting near the hospital entrance, saw a car approach that they believed was Dorothy's white 1973 Toyota station wagon. Its headlights swept toward them, and then, instead of stopping, the car turned and drove away, accelerating into the night. The headlights had been high and bright enough that neither man could make out who was behind the wheel. They could not say for certain whether Dorothy herself had been driving, whether she had been forced to drive by someone in the car with her, or whether someone else entirely had already taken control of the vehicle before it ever reached them. They waited, assuming at first that there had been some kind of misunderstanding, that she might circle back. She did not. After close to an hour, with no sign of her and no word, they reported her missing, and the report reached police in the earliest hours of May 29th, 1980. It is worth noting, because the exact hour matters in a case built almost entirely on a tight timeline, that some accounts place her disappearance in the late evening of May 28th, while the Orange County Sheriff's Department's own official case summary places the report of her disappearance shortly after midnight, meaning the window in which Dorothy vanished sits right at the boundary between those two calendar dates. Either way, what is certain is that within an hour of walking out to retrieve her car, Dorothy Jane Scott was gone, and everyone who might have seen what happened to her in that parking lot saw only a pair of blinding headlights and a car pulling away into the dark. The response was immediate. Though the leads were thin, detectives interviewed Dorothy's family, her co-workers, and the people who had last seen her, piecing together the timeline of the spider bite, the hospital visit, and the strange, sudden disappearance of her car, with her apparently still near or inside it. Just hours after she was reported missing, Santa Ana police found the answer to at least one part of the mystery. Dorothy's white Toyota station wagon was discovered on fire, abandoned in an alley in the 800 block of South Townsend Street in Santa Ana, roughly 10 miles from the hospital where she had last been seen. The car was empty. Whoever had driven it there, and whoever had set it burning, had left no trace of Dorothy herself, and no trace of their own identity. For investigators, the burned car raised the case from a routine disappearance to something far more ominous, an act that suggested deliberate concealment, a calculated effort to destroy whatever evidence the vehicle might have held. Combined with the months of threatening phone calls Dorothy had been receiving before she vanished, detectives began to treat her case as a probable abduction, quite possibly connected to whoever had been calling her at work. Though at that early stage they had no name, no description beyond a voice, and no way to connect that voice to any specific suspect. Detectives combed the area around the hospital and around the alley on South Townsend Street for physical evidence, canvassed neighbors and passers-by for anyone who might have seen the car or its driver, and worked to establish exactly who among Dorothy's co-workers, family, and acquaintances might have had a motive or an opportunity to harm her. The description they had to work with, a man's voice on a telephone and an unidentified figure behind a windshield lit up by its own headlights, gave them almost nothing to work from in an era before DNA testing existed in any usable form for criminal investigations, before cell phones could be tracked, and before security cameras were a routine fixture of hospital parking lots and city alleyways. Fingerprint analysis existed, of course, and had existed for decades, but it required a physical surface to lift a print from, and a burned-out car sitting in an alley for hours before it was even discovered offered detectives very little intact surface to work with. Blood typing existed as well, primitive by modern standards, capable at best of narrowing a pool of possible suspects rather than identifying one person with certainty the way DNA testing would decades later. What they had instead was patience, legwork, and the hope that whoever had done this would eventually make a mistake. For several weeks, the investigation continued without any significant breakthrough, until a phone call arrived that would become one of the most disturbing and enduring details of the entire case. On June 12, 1980, the Orange County Register, a local newspaper that had been covering Dorothy's disappearance, published a story detailing what was known about the case so far. That same day, an unidentified man called the paper's offices and reached the managing editor, a man named Pat O'Reilly. The caller told Riley, in chilling and deliberate terms, that he was responsible for what had happened to Dorothy. According to the account Riley later gave to police, the caller said, in essence, that Dorothy Scott had been his love, that he had caught her cheating with another man, that she had denied it, and that he had killed her. It would have been possible to dismiss the call as the work of someone seeking attention off the back of a widely reported disappearance, except for two details the caller offered that had never appeared anywhere in the published reporting. He knew that a coworker of Dorothy's had been bitten by a spider on the night she vanished, and he knew that Dorothy had changed the scarf she was wearing from black to red sometime before she arrived at the hospital that night. Neither detail had been printed in the Register's story or in any other public account of the case. To investigators, that meant the caller almost certainly had direct, first-hand knowledge of what happened to Dorothy in her final hours, knowledge that could only have come from someone who had actually been there, or from Dorothy's killer himself. If you find a case like this one as unsettling and as important to remember as we do, take a moment now to subscribe to this channel, because we bring you real, thoroughly researched cases like Dorothy's twice a week. Cases that deserve to be remembered accurately and told with the respect their victims are owed. The call to the newspaper was not the last time the killer, or someone claiming to be the killer, made contact. Beginning shortly after Dorothy's disappearance and continuing for the next 4 years, Dorothy's mother, Vera Scott, began receiving her own disturbing phone calls at the family home. The calls tended to come on Wednesdays, and often specifically when Vera happened to be home alone, a detail that suggested whoever was calling had some awareness of the family schedule and routines. Sometimes the caller would simply ask whether she was related to Dorothy Scott. When she confirmed that she was, he would say only, "I've got her," and hang up before she could respond. Other times he told her outright that he had killed her daughter. Police, aware of the pattern, eventually placed a recording device on the Scott family's telephone line in the hope of capturing enough of the calls to trace them. It never worked. The caller never stayed on the line long enough for investigators to pinpoint where the calls were originating from, and despite years of effort, his identity was never established through the calls themselves. For Dorothy's parents, those 4 years meant living with a particular, grinding kind of uncertainty, never knowing for certain whether their daughter might still somehow be alive somewhere, held by the man who kept calling, or whether the calls were simply a cruel and calculated form of torment inflicted by someone who already knew she was dead. Vera Scott has described, in accounts given to reporters over the years, the particular dread of hearing the telephone ring on a Wednesday, never knowing if it would be an ordinary call or the voice that had haunted her family since the spring of 1980. She has spoken of answering the phone with her hand shaking, of the strange, involuntary hope that flickered each time before the caller spoke, the small and terrible possibility that this time it might be Dorothy's own voice on the line instead of his. Investigators, for their part, could do little beyond listening, recording, and hoping that one call would last just long enough to be traced. It never did. Whether the caller understood how tracing technology worked in 1980, or simply through instinct and caution kept his calls short enough to avoid it, the effect was the same. A man who had apparently killed a young mother, and who seemed to want her family to know it, managed to evade every effort made to identify him across 4 full years of continuous contact. Then, in 1984, calls stopped. Their end coincided, in the grimmest possible way, with the moment the family's uncertainty was finally, partially resolved. On August 6, 1984, construction workers working in an area near Santa Ana Canyon Road, in the Anaheim Hills area of Orange County, discovered partial human remains in a brushy, overgrown section of land roughly 30 feet from the road, a stretch that had at some point in the intervening years been damaged by a brush fire. The remains were skeletal, badly deteriorated after more than 4 years exposed to the elements. Investigators used dental records to confirm what Dorothy's family had feared for so long, that the remains belonged to Dorothy Jane Scott. Because of the condition in which they were found, the coroner's office was unable to determine an exact cause of death. For years of exposure to sun, rain, and the passage of time had erased whatever physical evidence might once have pointed toward the manner in which she died, or toward the person responsible. The discovery answered one question that had haunted the family since May of 1980, confirming that Dorothy had not simply vanished into a new life somewhere, that she had been dead, in all likelihood, since very close to the night she disappeared. But it did not answer the question that mattered most. It did not reveal who had taken her, who had burned her car, who had called a newspaper editor with details only her killer could have known, or who had spent 4 years calling her grieving mother to taunt her with the words, "I've got her." The location where her remains were found, a stretch of brush along Santa Ana Canyon Road in the Anaheim Hills area, was itself a piece of information investigators had to work with carefully. It told them that whoever left her there had chosen a remote, overgrown area unlikely to be disturbed, and it told them that the same area had, at some point in the intervening years, been affected by a brush fire. A natural event common enough in the hills of Orange County, but one that had further degraded whatever remained of the physical evidence at the scene by the time construction crews stumbled upon it in 1984. In the years that followed the discovery of Dorothy's remains, investigators continued to work the case as an open homicide, interviewing dozens of people who had known Dorothy or who had crossed paths with the shop where she worked. Some leads went nowhere. At least one acquaintance who had reportedly expressed romantic interest in Dorothy, going so far as to speak of wanting to marry her, was questioned by detectives, but was never charged with any crime connected to her disappearance or death. In later years, as journalists and researchers revisited the case, one name surfaced repeatedly in connection with the theory that someone close to Dorothy's workplace might have been responsible. That name was Mike Butler, a man described in later reporting as having been infatuated with Dorothy, and who had a connection to the shop through his sister, who also worked there. Butler reportedly lived an alternative lifestyle in the nearby Santiago Mountains at the time. It is important to be precise here, because precision matters in a case where no one has ever been convicted. Mike Butler was never arrested. He was never formally charged with any crime in connection with Dorothy Jane Scott's disappearance or death. He has since died, which means that whatever suspicion attached to his name in the years after the case gained renewed attention can never be tested in a courtroom, and under the law, and under basic fairness to a man who cannot defend himself, he must be regarded as never having been proven responsible for anything that happened to Dorothy. It is also worth being honest about how these kinds of names tend to surface in long unsolved cases. Over 4 decades, dozens of people who knew Dorothy, worked near her, or crossed paths with her in the ordinary course of life in Anaheim and Orange County were looked at, questioned, and in almost every case, cleared or simply never developed into anything resembling a formal suspect. A case that stretches across 45 years accumulates names the way any long investigation does, some worth taking seriously, most eventually leading nowhere, and it falls to responsible reporting, and to responsible retellings of a case like this one, to resist the temptation to treat a name that surfaces in later journalism as equivalent to a name that was ever charged by prosecutors. The Orange County Sheriff's Department, which holds jurisdiction over the unresolved homicide investigation, has never publicly named an official suspect in the case, and no one, to this day, has ever been arrested or charged. Over the decades, true crime researchers and writers examining Dorothy Jane Scott's case have occasionally pointed to a possible connection between her disappearance and another unresolved Orange County case from roughly the same era, the disappearance of a woman named Patricia Jean Schneider, whose car, much like Dorothy's, was found burned after she vanished. It is a theory that has circulated in true crime writing and online discussion for years, built on the surface similarity between the two cases. It has never been confirmed by investigators, and no official statement has ever established any link between what happened to Dorothy Scott and what happened to Patricia Jean Schneider. It remains, as of today, an unproven theory rather than an established fact, and it should be understood as exactly that, a possibility some researchers have raised, not a conclusion supported by evidence. Dorothy's case did, in time, reach a wider audience beyond Orange County. It was later profiled on the television series Cold Case Files, a program built around the small number of cold cases that had, at the time each episode aired, actually been solved, which places Dorothy's story in an unusual position. A case featured on a show largely dedicated to resolutions, presented instead as one of the mysteries that had defied one. The episode introduced her story, and the eerie detail of the killer's calls to a newspaper editor and to her own mother, to viewers across the country who had never heard of her before. And in the years since, her case has continued to circulate through true crime podcasts, articles, and online cold case communities, kept alive not by new evidence, but by people who simply refuse to let her story fade into obscurity. That kind of continued attention matters in cases like this one. Cold cases are sometimes solved not because of a new piece of forensic technology alone, but because renewed public attention reaches someone who has held on to a piece of information for years, sometimes decades, without realizing its significance, or without ever having a clear way to bring it forward. For Dorothy's parents, the years after 1984 brought no further resolution. Jacob Scott, Dorothy's father, died in 1994 on what would have been her birthday, according to family accounts, without ever learning who had taken his daughter from him. Vera Scott, Dorothy's mother, the woman who had answered the phone so many times over 4 long years to hear a stranger tell her, "I've got her," lived until 2002, 22 years after her daughter disappeared, and she too died without an answer. Dorothy's son, only 4 years old when his mother vanished from that hospital parking lot, grew up in the shadow of a case that never closed, raised largely by his grandparents and other family members in a household forever marked by the absence at its center. He would have had almost no memories of his own of the mother who raised him for those first 4 years, and instead grew up inheriting a story, pieced together from what relatives could tell him, and later from what journalists and true crime writers published about the mystery that swallowed his early childhood. In interviews given decades later, members of Dorothy's family have described the particular difficulty of grieving someone whose death was never fully explained, a grief without the ordinary landmarks of an arrest, a trial, or a conviction to mark some kind of ending. The people who loved Dorothy Jane Scott spent decades waiting for a phone call that would finally explain what happened to her, instead of one more taunting call from a man who was never identified. It is worth remembering, too, that Dorothy Jane Scott's case did not happen in isolation, and that Orange County and the wider region of Southern California carried a heavy weight of unresolved violence throughout the late 1970s and into the 1980s, a period during which several serial offenders operated across the same freeways and suburban neighborhoods where Dorothy lived and worked, often for years before ever being identified. Some of those cases that sat unsolved for just as long as Dorothy's, or longer, have in more recent years finally been closed, not through the kind of investigative work that was possible in 1980, but through genetic genealogy techniques that did not exist at the time Dorothy vanished and did not exist even when her remains were found in 1984. Those breakthroughs offer a genuine, evidence-based reason to believe that a case like Dorothy's is not necessarily beyond hope simply because it has remained open for more than 4 decades. If any physical evidence connected to the original investigation still exists in an evidence locker somewhere in Orange County, and if modern forensic techniques could ever be applied to it, there remains a real possibility, however uncertain, that the voice on those telephone calls could finally be matched to a name. As of today, more than 4 decades after Dorothy Jane Scott disappeared from that parking lot in Orange, California, her case remains classified as an open and unresolved homicide investigation by the Orange County Sheriff's Department. Advances in forensic science and DNA analysis that did not exist in 1980, and that were still developing even in 1984 when her remains were found, mean that if new physical evidence or new information were ever to surface, there remains a genuine possibility that the case could still be solved. Investigators with the department's Homicide Task Force have continued, in the years since, to periodically revisit the file, and the case remains listed publicly among Orange County's unresolved homicides, a formal acknowledgement that it has never been closed and never been abandoned. Tips can also be submitted anonymously through Orange County Crime Stoppers, a resource established specifically to give people a way to come forward with information without having to identify themselves directly to investigators, an option that may matter a great deal to anyone who has carried a piece of this case privately for years out of fear or uncertainty about what to do with it. But as things stand, no arrest has ever been made. No one has ever been formally charged. The identity of the man who stalked Dorothy with threatening phone calls in the months before she disappeared, who very likely drove her car away from that hospital parking lot on the night of May 28, 1980, who called a newspaper editor days later with details only her killer could have known, and who spent 4 years calling her mother to say, "I've got her," has never been established. What is documented and beyond dispute is this: the months of frightening calls before she vanished, the night she disappeared from a hospital where she had gone to help an injured coworker, the burned and abandoned car found hours later, the confession call to a newspaper editor containing facts that had not been made public, the 4 years of taunting calls to her mother, and the discovery of her remains in August of 1984 near Santa Ana Canyon Road. What remains unknown, and what may never be known unless someone comes forward with new information, is who was responsible. Cases like this one are not solved by documentaries alone, but they are sometimes solved because a documentary reaches the one person, somewhere, who has carried a piece of information for decades without ever knowing where to take it, or without ever feeling that it mattered enough to come forward. If you have any information about the disappearance and death of Dorothy Jane Scott, the Orange County Sheriff's Department asks that you contact them directly at 714-647-7000. More than 40 years later, the case remains open, exactly as it has been since the summer of 1980, waiting for the one piece of information that could finally give Dorothy Jane Scott's family the answer they never received. If you found value in this story, please consider hitting subscribe and leaving a like, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next real cold case investigation. We truly appreciate your support. Thanks for listening and watching.